They thought he was just a regular guy visiting his dad. But when the HOA's fake security squad drew a gun over a parking spot, they had no clue they were aiming at the man who trains Navy SEALs in tactical combat. My son disarmed the situation and legally then turned the entire neighborhood meeting into a courtroom-style expose. And when we showed the footage and his military credentials, the HOA president turned white. The so-called cop, arrested for impersonating an officer and brandishing a weapon, never mess with someone who trains warriors for a living, that it was supposed to be a peaceful Sunday, clear skies, birds chirping, and my son Jake pulling up the driveway for a long overdue visit after 6 months at a naval training base, where he served as the lead hand-to-hand combat instructor for active-duty Navy SEAL teams, a role few knew he held because of his quiet nature and calm demeanor, traits that masked the intense discipline and lethal skill beneath. I was sipping coffee on the porch when Jake parked his matte black SUV in front of my house, stepping out in worn jeans and a hoodie, blending in as a regular guy, though every movement of his radiated precision and purpose. He hugged me. We laughed about old times, and for once, everything felt calm until the golf cart with sirens and poorly attached security decals rounded the corner like it was chasing down fugitives. Rick and Trent, the self-appointed HOA patrol officers, had arrived, and I already felt my stomach tighten. These two had been escalating things in the neighborhood for months, acting more like rogue vigilantes than any kind of proper neighborhood watch, handing out citations for flower pots out of regulation and threatening fines for garage doors left open too long. Jake's car was barely parked 15 minutes when Rick pulled up behind it, radio crackling for dramatic effect. Stepping out in his dollar store tactical vest, clipboard in hand, barking, "This vehicle is visitor parking without permit." Jake turned calm as always and replied, "I'm visiting my father, this is his house," motioning toward me. Trent, always the sidekick with more attitude than brains, hopped out, gloved and sunglasses on, acting like we were in the middle of a hostage situation. "Need to see ID and registration," he demanded, stepping forward. Jake's expression didn't change, but I noticed the subtle shift in his posture, shoulders square, feet placed just right, like a coiled spring. "You're not law enforcement," Jake said, voice firm, yet controlled. "You have no authority to request that." Rick puffed up, clipboard shaking. "We are the designated enforcement body for this HOA. Non-compliance will result in immediate towing and a citation." I stood to intervene, but before I could speak, Trent reached to his waistband and, God help me, pulled out a black semi-automatic handgun and aimed it at my son's chest, saying, "Last chance, step back and provide ID, or we'll escalate this." My heart stopped. Jake's eyes didn't blink, didn't flinch. He stepped forward just slightly, voice dropping into a chilling calm. "Put the weapon down. Now. You are brandishing a firearm at an unarmed civilian without cause. This is illegal." Trent smirked, probably thinking Jake was bluffing, not realizing he'd just pointed a gun at a man who trained elite warriors for a living. What happened next happened faster than I could process. Jake shifted his weight, stepped in, and in a single flowing motion, disarmed Trent, one hand redirecting the weapon, the other twisting Trent's wrist into a locked position, the gun clattering harmlessly onto the sidewalk, and Trent hitting the pavement with a shocked grunt, pinned beneath Jake's knee, unable to move. Rick staggered backward, hands raised, sputtering, "You can't touch him. That's assault." Jake looked up at me and said, "Dad, call the police, real ones." My hand shook as I dialed, and when the dispatcher answered, I didn't even know where to begin. Jake remained perfectly still, controlling Trent without injuring him, calmly explaining the situation as neighbors began to emerge from behind blinds and screen doors, drawn by the chaos, phones recording. Within 10 minutes, a real police cruiser arrived, lights flashing, sirens briefly blaring, and 2 uniformed officers stepped out, guns holstered but hands ready, assessing the scene quickly. Jake released Trent and stepped back, hands raised, then calmly presented his military ID and explained the situation with clipped, professional efficiency. I showed them my Ring doorbell footage, which had captured everything from the moment Rick and Trent rolled in to the second the gun came out, and Jake diffused the entire situation without a punch thrown. The officers reviewed the footage, took statements, and after radioing in, they confirmed that Trent had no license to carry and no legal authority to enforce anything. Within minutes, they were cuffing him, charging him with brandishing a weapon, impersonating an officer, and reckless endangerment. Rick was told to sit down and shut up as they checked the fake decals on their cart, and noted the alarming way this so-called HOA patrol had been operating. One of the officers, a veteran himself, quietly asked Jake where he'd learned to move like that, and when Jake mentioned he trained SEALs, the cop just nodded with a slight grin. "That explains it." As Trent was driven away, Rick protested, loudly, still insisting they were acting within HOA rights, but no one was listening anymore. The neighborhood was watching, mouths agape as the fantasy power trip of the HOA patrol came crashing down in one glorious, well-deserved reality check. Jake and I returned to the porch, silence thick around us, until I finally asked him, what if that had gone wrong? He just sipped his coffee and replied, it didn't. But now they know don't point a gun at someone who teaches people how to take down terrorists in the dark. And just like that, my peaceful Sunday had turned into the beginning of the HOA's worst nightmare. The aftermath of the incident should have been simple: Trent arrested, Rick publicly humiliated, the HOA humbled into rethinking its fake authority, but instead, it ignited something uglier: ego, denial, and a last-ditch power grab that turned the neighborhood into a legal battleground. Just 3 days after the confrontation, I received a formal notice from the HOA, shoved into my mailbox in a red envelope marked urgent legal action pending. The letter inside accused my son of assaulting community officers, disrupting neighborhood peace, and instigating violence, all of which were laughably contradicted by the security footage now circulating among homeowners like wildfire. To top it off, they fined me $500 and demanded an apology from Jake or face a potential ban from the community. I stared at the letter, stunned by the audacity, and handed it to Jake, who read it without changing expression. So, they want to escalate, he said, tone calm and surgical, like a man planning a mission rather than a grudge. He spent that evening compiling everything: ring footage, the police report, Trent's arrest details, legal excerpts from state law, and the full HOA bylaws downloaded from the neighborhood portal. As it turned out, Rick and his clown patrol had never received official approval for armed enforcement duties. The board never voted on it. There was no policy about security vehicles, use of force, or even a chain of command. They had made it all up, and now they were panicking because they got caught. Jake drafted a formal complaint letter addressed to the entire HOA board, citing every legal infraction, and copied both the sheriff's department and a local attorney who specialized in HOA abuse cases. He printed 20 copies and passed them out to residents on his morning run, calmly explaining what had happened and urging them to attend the upcoming HOA meeting. Word spread like wildfire. Neighbors who'd lived under the HOA's tyrannical rule for years began to speak up. One told Jake that Rick had once fined him $200 for leaving a holiday wreath up past the authorized date. Another admitted Rick had threatened to have his dog confiscated for barking too loudly on the 4th of July. For years, residents had tolerated it out of fear, believing the board held actual legal power. But now, thanks to Jake's quiet resistance and tactical mind, the curtain had been pulled back, revealing nothing but a bunch of ego-driven bullies hiding behind clipboards and fake badges. By the time the HOA meeting rolled around on Friday, the community center was packed. Folding chairs filled the room, every seat taken, with more people standing against the walls and spilling into the hallway. Susan, the HOA president, sat at the front table next to Rick, who looked like a balloon ready to pop. Trent, recently released on bail and banned from carrying a weapon, was noticeably absent. Jake and I entered quietly, and I swear you could feel the energy shift. People turned to him, nodding respectfully, grateful that someone had finally stood up to the madness. Susan opened the meeting with Force.com, reading from a pre-written script. We understand there was a recent incident involving community security and a resident visitor that has caused confusion and concern. We'd like to clarify that all actions were taken in accordance with HOA safety procedures. Jake stood without waiting for permission, holding his folder of evidence. There were no procedures, he said, voice low but carrying. There were no votes, no legal approval, no authority. What happened was a civilian pointed a gun at another civilian without cause. That's not confusion. That's a felony. A few people gasped. Susan tried to interrupt, but Jake stepped forward. I've trained elite military units in how to neutralize threats and handle escalation. I recognized the danger immediately, and I acted to protect my father and myself. You're lucky no one was hurt. He placed a police report and printed stills from the porch footage on the front table. Here is proof. If you continue to pretend this was justified, I will file a civil suit against this board, including each member individually, for negligence and malicious enforcement. The room erupted in murmurs. Rick stood up, red-faced and trembling. This is slander. We have authority. Jake looked him dead in the eye. No, Rick, you had a fantasy. That fantasy ended the second you let an untrained man with a gun play cop in a peaceful neighborhood. Your actions were criminal. You're lucky the person he pointed that weapon at didn't break his wrist permanently or worse. Jake then turned to the residents. I'm not a lawyer. I'm not a politician, but I know abuse of power when I see it. You all do too. The HOA needs oversight. You need transparency, or this kind of thing will happen again. The silence was thunderous. Then, someone started clapping. Another joined. Within seconds, the room filled with applause, not rowdy or wild, but long and steady, the kind that comes when truth finally cuts through fear. Susan realized they were cornered. She cleared her throat and announced, effective immediately, the HOA patrol program is suspended. The fine issued to Mr. Parker's residence is voided, and a formal apology will be drafted and delivered. Rick tried to object, but Susan shut him down with a single glance. And you could almost see the resignation in his slouched shoulders as he realized the neighborhood he once terrorized no longer feared him. Over the next few days, the changes came fast. The HOA patrol was disbanded. The golf cart was towed away and sold to pay legal costs. Susan resigned a week later under pressure from angry homeowners, and 3 new board members were elected people who promised to serve, not rule. Jake didn't attend the second meeting. He said he'd done what needed to be done and went back to base 2 days later. Leaving behind a quiet street and a neighborhood still buzzing from the fallout of the storm he calmly walked through. On his way out, he said something I'll never forget. Sometimes you don't need to fight with fists, just facts, timing, and the will to stand when others sit. And that's exactly what he did. My son, the quiet warrior, didn't just train SEALs, he trained a whole neighborhood to stop being afraid of bullies in uniforms that weren't real. And somewhere in a courtroom, a man named Trent was still answering for the moment he learned, far too late, that you never pull a gun on someone who trains the people trained to never miss.